Every other video, we talk about how to win your fantasy leagues, but today we're going to do some fantasy football evangelism. So grab your girlfriend, boyfriend, siblings, parents, workmates, or friends and send them this way. Share them this video. And if you're new to the channel, welcome. Today you're going to learn about the greatest game on earth. This is fantasy football on the Fantasy First Down. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. If you have any questions about today's video, please hit me up on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. Of course, you can also leave some questions in the comments. I'll always answer any of your questions in my DMs. If you decide to join a fantasy league after watching this video, you should check out my website, ffdfantasyfootball.com, where I've got my rankings and a heap of other advice as well. I'll explain in my video how the rankings work and how you can use them. Without further ado, let's get into it. The sport is American football, or as we call it in this video, football. If you already have a fundamental understanding of the sport, I'd recommend skipping through this part. I've got a link below on the timestamp so you can get to the right part of the video for you. Now, football has 11 players on two teams attempting to score points by moving the ball into their opponent's end zone, by passing the ball or running the ball downfield to score touchdowns, or by kicking the ball through the uprights to score field goals or extra points. Games are broken up into 4 quarters of 15 minutes, though the clock will stop in certain situations. Each quarter involves playing a number of downs or plays. A play starts when the ball is snapped, that is, thrown backwards through someone's legs, and then the play continues until a pass is unsuccessful, a player is successfully tackled, the ball or a player holding it goes out of play, a touchdown scored, a field goal scored, or the referee just stops the play in some other way. Once a play is over, teams reset and in most situations can make substitutions before the next play ensues. The team with the ball, called the offensive team, gets 4 downs, or plays, or snaps, to move the ball 10 yards down the field. If they succeed in moving the ball at least 10 yards, they receive a new set of 4 downs, and the process continues until they either fail to move the ball down the field at least 10 yards, score a touchdown or field goal, or turn the ball over to the defensive team. They can also be penalized yards by the refs as well. Football's a complicated sport, so I'm only going to be briefly highlighting the basics you'll need to understand how to play fantasy football. Now, football teams are broken up into 3 groups: offensive players, defensive players, and special teamers. In fantasy football, we primarily focus on the offensive players. The most important position in football, and arguably in professional sports, is the quarterback. This is the position played by most of the famous footballers. We're talking Tom Brady, Patrick Mahomes, Peyton Manning, and Aaron Rodgers. Plus, if you're a music fan, there's Ciara's husband, Russell Wilson, Haley Steinfeld's boyfriend, Josh Allen, not to mention the ex of both Jessica Simpson and Carrie Underwood, Tony Romo. So, these guys are not only great football players, they're basically celebrities across the US. Quarterbacks run the offense and touch the ball on almost every play. Their job is to distribute the ball to their teammates by passing the ball downfield. It's considered a pass if the ball travels forward, or by handing it off or pitching it to players beside or behind them. They can also choose to hold onto the ball themselves and run with it down the field. There are players more accustomed to running the ball, though. These are called running backs. Some running backs who've drifted into the public sphere include pseudo-actor Marshawn Lynch, LaDainian Tomlinson, Adrian Peterson, O.J. Simpson, Kim Kardashian's ex, Reggie Bush, and the greatest running back at the moment, Christian McCaffrey. The primary job of the running back is to be handed or tossed the ball and to run the ball down the field as far as possible. This will happen on a little under half of the plays in a game. Anytime this player is handed the ball or has the ball moved backward to them, their ensuing run forward is called a rush. The best running backs will rush the ball about 15 to 20 times in a game. Many teams will use a rotation of 3 to 4 running backs and sometimes have 2 on the field at one time. Plus, they'll also use a fullback, who's a type of running back whose main job is to block the opposition. Running backs can also receive passes from the quarterback, though these will usually be short, simple passes. Most passes, however, will go to the wide receivers. These players will usually run down the field to catch passes. Some famous names include Terrell Owens, Calvin Johnson, Randy Moss, and the player who invented the gritty, Justin Jefferson. Anytime the ball is passed towards a player, this is called a target. If the wide receiver successfully catches the ball, this is called a reception. Elite wide receivers will make 10 to 12 receptions in a solid game, though this is really highly variable depending on the matchup and how the game flow goes. Other players can catch passes too, but tight ends also have a second job. On some plays, they will protect the quarterback or running back by blocking defensive players. These players are hence usually bigger and stronger than wide receivers without the same elite speed. The most famous tight end is, of course, Travis Kelce, the boyfriend of someone named Taylor Swift. Apparently, she's a big deal or something. On a given play, an NFL team will usually have one quarterback, one running back, three wide receivers, and one tight end on the field. There can feasibly be any combination of six players in these four positions. But wait a second, Ben. You said football was 11 on 11. Yeah, for the sake of fantasy football, though, we don't care about those other five players. They're called offensive linemen, and while extremely valuable for the team's success, outside exceptional circumstances, they're not allowed to catch a pass, rush, or catch the ball. A non-offensive player who is relevant to fantasy football, though, is the kicker. When a team has used 3 of their 4 downs, instead of risking handing the ball over to their opponent, they can instead choose to kick the ball through the uprights. This is called a field goal, and it gives the team 3 points. Additionally, after each touchdown a team scores, they have the opportunity to kick the ball through the uprights for what's called an extra point. The person who does this kicking is unsurprisingly called the kicker. Of course, over half a football team is made up of players we haven't even mentioned. But for the sake of fantasy football, these players aren't really important to us. So when is this football being played? Well, the National Football League, the professional league for American football, contains 32 teams from across the US, and they play their games from about September into January. These teams are broken into 2 conferences, while each conference is broken into 4 divisions. Each team will play the other 3 teams in its division twice each year, while also competing against other teams from other divisions and even from the other conference. These non-divisional opponents will change each season. They play 1 game a week with the exception of their 1 week off. This week off is called a bye week, and it occurs at different times for different teams. Teams hence play a total of 17 games over 18 weeks. Each team has a roster of as many as 55 players, with 53 of them active, in addition to a practice squad of 16 players and sometimes 1 additional international player. Of these 72 players in total, only 48 players can be used in a given game, with 11 on the field at a time. At the end of the NFL regular season, 14 teams make the playoffs to compete for the Super Bowl and that elusive Super Bowl ring. The playoffs aren't relevant to fantasy football, as the fantasy football season will generally end after the second last week of the regular season. So why the second last week? Well, in the last week, many teams rest their best players, which can cause a real headache for fantasy football managers competing for their fantasy Super Bowl. Though this setting, as with many others we'll discuss in this video, does depend a little on the nuances of your specific league. Regardless, there are many more videos around which will go into far more detail about the nuances of football as a whole, but it's time to actually talk about fantasy football. So fantasy football is a competition between a group of people to establish who has the greatest understanding of the game of football, or, in reality, the greatest mix of skill and luck. In most competitions, the goal of fantasy football is to score more points than your opponent in a given week. Your team receives points based on the real-life performance of your chosen players. The team with the most points wins that week. At the end of the regular season, usually the first 13 or 14 weeks of the season, the teams with the most wins will advance to a knockout competition called the playoffs. The ultimate winner is the team who wins their playoff games to become the ultimate fantasy football champion. What an honor. Your fantasy football team will typically be made up of some combination of quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, kickers, and something called DSTs, which we'll talk about later. Quarterbacks are, surprisingly, one of the least valuable positions. They score points by passing the ball. Ordinarily, they get 0.04 points per yard pass. This means they get 1 point for every 25 yards they pass the ball. This is calculated from the point where the play started to the location where the play ended. So it doesn't really matter where they passed the ball from or where it got caught. Of course, they'll only receive these points if the pass was successfully caught. Quarterbacks will, however, score most of their points through passing touchdowns. Each time a quarterback passes the ball to a player who scores a touchdown, they receive 4 to 6 points, depending on your league setting. If they accidentally pass the ball to an opposing player instead, This is called an interception. When this occurs, the quarterback will typically be punished with -1 to -3 points, depending on your league. The last way quarterbacks can score points is by rushing the ball. Rushes are worth 0.1 points per yard, so you need to rush for 10 yards to get 1 point. If a quarterback rushes the ball for a touchdown, they receive 6 points. Some quarterbacks, such as Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts, are very productive runners and will rush the ball up to a dozen times in a game, making them very valuable. Jalen Hurts, in particular, has become famous for something called the tush push, or the brotherly shove, named after Philadelphia, Hurts' team, the city of brotherly love. This made him very successful in fantasy football last year. Funnily, even though quarterbacks score the most points, because there's 32 quarterbacks in the league and your team only needs one, this position's not very valuable for fantasy football. To compensate for this, some leagues will include an extra spot where you can use a second quarterback. This is called a super flex league, named after the super flex spot, and it makes quarterbacks extremely valuable. Running backs have traditionally been the most valuable position in fantasy, though. In most leagues, you'll be required to start at least 2 running backs each week. They receive most of their points by rushing, getting 0.1 points for each yard rushed. Note that yardage for rushing, receiving, and passing is calculated from where the ball started to where it ended, not from where the player received the ball or from where it was passed. Many leagues will also give bonus points for big rushing games or big individual rushes. A good player will rush for over 100 yards a number of times during the season. These players also score a lot of touchdowns, receiving a whopping 6 points for each one. Running backs will also receive some passes. These also give them 0.1 points for each yard received. Now, this is where things get a little bit complicated. In most leagues these days, players will also receive points for just catching receptions as well. This is called PPR, which stands for point per reception. Most leagues will be PPR, which means each time a player gets a reception, they get a point in addition to the points from the yards they earn. In some leagues, this is balanced a little by giving 0.5 points per reception. This is called half PPR. Plus, some traditional leagues still don't use points for receptions at all. This is becoming increasingly rare, but it is called non-PPR. And in some places, it's called standard, but not all. So don't get confused by that. So if a player catches the ball and gains 7 yards, they'll receive 1.7 points in PPR, 1.2 points in half PPR, and 0.7 points in non-PPR. Understandably, this makes a big difference. You'll see on many websites the opportunity to separate rankings based on this setting. So it's vital to understand whether your league is PPR, half PPR, or non-PPR. In a non-PPR or half PPR league, running backs are extremely valuable, and Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, and Bijan Robinson will likely be the players all competitors crave. Though even in a PPR league, dual threat running backs will also receive a lot of passes, are tremendously valuable. In the modern NFL, many teams also use what's called a committee approach. This is where they rotate their running backs by situation in order to reduce their workload and keep them healthy. As a result, running backs that are on the field the majority of the time are particularly valuable due to this scarcity. In a PPR league, though, things are a little bit more balanced and wide receivers increase in value a lot. You'll generally start 2 to 3 wide receivers depending on your league settings. These players receive most of their points from reception yards and in PPR from the receptions themselves. Though they do also score touchdowns and in some cases will get some rushes as well. Along with running backs, these players are tremendously valuable, and you'd expect every fantasy team in your league to have at least 6 to 7 wide receivers and 5 to 6 running backs on your roster, depending on the settings of your league. Tight ends receive points in the same way as wide receivers, but in most leagues you only start 1. They still have some value though, as most tight ends spend a lot of their time blocking or rotating off the field. A tight end whose primary role is to catch passes is comparatively valuable. That's why Travis Kelce's been one of the biggest names in fantasy football for years. Some leagues will try to balance this by giving tight ends an extra point for each reception. This is called a tight end premium, though it is quite rare. It's also worth noting that all offensive players can also lose points if they fumble the ball. That is to say, they let a ball they were possessing slip from their grip and into the possession of the opposition. This usually costs 1 to 3 negative points depending on your league. In addition to these starting spots, most leagues will also have between 1 and 3 flex spots. These spots can be used on either a running back a wide receiver, or a tight end. In a PPR league, you would expect to use this spot for a wide receiver most weeks. In half PPR, you will usually be used by a running back, but you could feasibly be used on any of those positions. It just depends on what you have available to you. Finally, many leagues also allow you to draft kickers and DSTs. The kicker receives points for kicking the ball through the uprights. Typically, an extra point, which happens after most touchdowns, will give the kicker 1 point, while a missed extra point, which is pretty rare, will cost them -1 point or more. Kickers receive most of their points through field goals, though. These give them 3 to 5 points depending on how long the kick is. Most kickers will attempt 1 to 3 field goals a game and a handful of extra points. They do get you a solid amount of points, but they're still the least valuable and most replaceable players in fantasy football, and incidentally in the NFL. You'll often hear discussions about streaming kickers and streaming other positions. This basically means use a different kicker each week, and it tends to be the best strategy because kickers are more reliant on their matchup rather than their actual team. That's my recommended strategy, and I release an article on Razzball each week outlining my preferred streamers for the week. Now, DST stands for Defense and Special Teams. So the other 60% of the NFL team we haven't talked about all gets reduced into one position. Now, when you draft a DST, you're not drafting an individual player. You're drafting a whole defensive and special teams component of an NFL team. For example, if I drafted the Baltimore Ravens DST, which was last year's best DST, I'm drafting the entire Ravens defense and special teams units. DST receive points in a number of ways, and the exact amount of points depends on the league settings. Firstly, they receive points by stopping their opponent from scoring actual points. For example, if the Ravens defense effectively stops their opponents from scoring points in a game, the Ravens defense will score a lot of fantasy points that week. In some leagues, 10 points, 15 points just for that. The more points the Ravens' opponent scores, the less points the Ravens DST receives that week. And if the other team scores a lot of points, 30, 40, 50 points, the Ravens DST is probably going to score negative points that week. So there is some risk. DSTs also get points from good defensive plays. Sacks, which is basically when the quarterback is tackled before he can throw the ball. Interceptions, which is when the quarterback throws the ball to the defensive team. Fumble recoveries, which is when the ball gets dropped by an offensive player and picked up and taken by the defense. And safeties, which is when the offensive team is tackled in the defensive team's end zone. DSTs also score points in their special teams units as well. An NFL game starts each half and restarts after each touchdown or field goal with a kickoff. The further the special teams player runs the ball up the field from these kickoffs, the more points their DST will score. These are called kick returns. And in some leagues, that individual player will also score points for that exact same action. Additionally, teams will sometimes use an Australian to punt the ball down the field because that's what we're good for, in order to gain field position. If the team receiving the kick moves the ball back up the field after catching it, they receive points as well. This is called a punt return. Finally, if either a defensive player, a kick returner, or a punt returner scores a touchdown in this process, they score 6 points for your DST. DSTs are annoying and inconsistent, and I don't like them. They lack value in all leagues. You should always draft kickers and DSTs in the last 2 rounds. There are no exceptions. Now, this all seems pretty simple. You get the best 8 to 10 players, you can start them every week, and you're good. But the NFL's rarely that simple. Injuries are prevalent in the NFL and have a huge impact on fantasy football. Typically, about half of the league's starting running backs will miss games due to injury in a season, while the other positions are also impacted a lot as well. Additionally, every team has a bye week, meaning even if your players stay healthy, you'll still be without them once in a season. Finally, coaches are impatient beasts, and if their players aren't performing, even if they're valuable in fantasy football, they can lose their starting jobs. As a result, your fantasy roster will include a bench. This contains 6 to 9 players depending on your settings. Players can be moved from your starting lineup to your bench. They don't score points on your bench, but they are available to you in other weeks. You can move them at any time up until their game starts that week. As a result, you would expect your starting lineup to look different each week because of injuries, buys, and changes in player performance. Plus, sometimes players just play against bad teams and they're going to be more beneficial that week. I would recommend that your bench should include mostly running backs and wide receivers who have the potential to become good starting players if the situation arises. There's heaps of articles out there, and I have lots of rankings to tell you which players to pick up and who you should start in a given week and who should remain on your bench. You should also never have a kicker or DST on your bench. Ever. Ever. But what if your player gets injured? Typically, you would place them on your bench. Or if it's a serious injury and if you don't really need that player, you could drop them and replace them with someone else. This process will be discussed later. In many leagues, though, you'll get a few IR spots. This stands for injured reserve. These IR spots can only be taken by injured players and allow you to store these players without wasting a spot on your roster. But how do you actually get your players onto your team? Well, unlike most fantasy sports, in fantasy football, every player is owned by only one person in the league. Most fantasy football leagues will contain around 8 to 16 people, though it's usually assumed across the industry that a team will contain 12 people, even if it doesn't. The most fundamental form of a fantasy league is called a redraft league. The roughly 12 people will meet up in person or online and hold a draft. In the draft, you will draft your roster of roughly 14 to 20 players. These are the players you can choose from during the regular season. But how does the draft work? For most, the draft is the highlight of the fantasy football season. Competitors will be allocated an order. This is often done randomly, but it can be organized based on previous results or by using some sort of arbitrary competition. Some people use the Kentucky Derby picking, others will run a 40-yard dash. Whole heap of fantastic ideas on how to do this online. Or you can just draw names out of a hat. Competitors will then take it in turn selecting players onto their teams. The process of every competitor selecting one player is called a round. After each round, the order is reversed so that competitors selecting later are not unduly disadvantaged. This switching process between rounds is called a snake draft and is quite standard, though occasionally leagues will make adjustments to this format, such as holding an auction or by not switching every single round. Now, many drafts are held live. This doesn't actually mean in person, it just means that everyone will be active throughout the draft. As a result, each competitor is given a time limit for their picks. This can be from 30 seconds to 5 minutes, or if all competitors are in one location, just until someone gets annoyed that they're taking too long. If a player doesn't select a player in time, they will be allocated one based on a pre-selected list, which usually comes from the website you're using. This is called an auto draft, and it's a great dishonor. You do not want to be that guy or girl. Now, other drafts will be held over a longer period, with each player taking their time to select a player. These drafts typically have a time limit of 2 to 10 hours, though some will also have no time limit, just relying on players being good people. These drafts can take weeks as a result. Even though some drafts are held in person, and this is optimal for enjoyment, most drafts will be held online, and all leagues, no matter where the draft is held, will be run off some sort of hosting website. There are many hosting options, and they all operate differently. It is usually easier to draft off a PC or laptop and run your team during the season through an app on your phone, though you can feasibly do it the other way around as well. My preferred host is called Sleeper, though you can also use Fantrax, ESPN, NFL.com, Flea Flicker, MLF, Yahoo. There's so many out there, it's crazy. Ultimately, though, you don't need to worry about that. The draft will be held on a site selected by whoever's running your league. The person running your league is called a commissioner. In a good league, they'll create the rules, ensure fairness and equity is maintained, and sort out any disputes. They're also in charge of the finances, though if you don't know the commissioner of your league, ideally they should store all the funds online on a site such as LeagueSafe, which makes sure that if something goes wrong, you'll get your money back. Regardless, understanding the app or website you're using is really important, and I recommend checking out the guide on that website to make sure you understand how it all works. But how do you actually know which players to draft during your draft? Well, that's a difficult question, and it's what makes fantasy football fun and dynamic. Many people rely on online experts like myself. There are literally hundreds of sites that will offer a list of rankings you can use during your drafts, and you can find mine at ffdfantasyfootball.com. The last 2 years might have been rated in the top 10 for accuracy, so naturally, I recommend them if your goal is to win. Accuracy in fantasy football is, of course, how close your predictions are to reality, and it's measured by a site called Fantasy Pros. Incidentally, I also recommend using Fantasy Pros for rankings if you're new, just because it's very easy to follow. Fantasy Pros creates rankings by combining about 200 of the most accurate experts from around the world. So if you don't know who to trust, at least that way, you're going to make sure that you get a good cross section of people. My rankings are also, of course, incorporated in their consensus rankings. So, what are rankings and how do you use them? So, rankings are basically just a list of players based on their expected value for the upcoming season. Some people will rank players just within their given position. So, you know which quarterbacks, which running backs, which wide receivers, which tight ends are best based on that order. Other people will mush all the players together and just put them in one big list. And you can use either of those, whichever works better for you. The higher a player is on the list, the more likely they are to help your fantasy team. And I recommend that you cross players off your list so you don't make the mistake of trying to draft someone who's already been taken by another team. This is also a great dishonor. Hence, when you're drafting your fantasy team, it makes sense to draft the player which is highest on whichever list you're using. Of course, there are some caveats I'll go into later. For example, there's no need to draft a fifth running back when you don't have any wide receivers left. You've got to be a little bit sensible about what you want and what you need. Regardless of where you get your rankings, though, it's vital that you understand your individual league settings. This can usually be found on the website used to host your league. The most important thing to look for is the reception setting I mentioned earlier. That's PPR, half PPR, non PPR. You should also consider how many points you get for a passing touchdown and, very importantly, how many players of each position you start each week. For example, if you have to start 3 wide receivers instead of 2 each week, that's going to make wide receivers more valuable due to scarcity. If this is all a little bit intimidating, don't worry. I'm here to help. For a very small fee, I can write you up a list of rankings specifically catered to your individual league settings, along with a heap of tips for your draft day. So send me an email at benwasley23@gmail.com, or you can DM me on Instagram and Twitter. I showed those earlier if this interests you. Regardless of what happens in your draft, though, just enjoy the draft day, as it's often the highlight of the season, especially if you do it live with friends. But what if you don't like the team you drafted? Well, never fear. You're not stuck with that team of players for the whole season. You can improve your team during the season in 2 ways. The first method is to make trades. This is when 2 competitors agree to a hopefully mutually beneficial arrangement where they permanently swap players. For example, I might have a lot of good running backs and no good wide receivers, so I might swap one of my running backs for a wide receiver. This can get pretty complex, but it's very common, and in some leagues it occurs 30 to 40 times during the season. If you're new to fantasy football, I would personally avoid doing any trades without getting the advice of an expert or someone you actually trust. For example, you're welcome to DM me on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and I'll give you some advice. The second method for improving your team is by adding free agents. After each week of games, waivers are held. This is a process where teams add unowned players to their teams, replacing unwanted existing players. But what if multiple teams want the same player? In some leagues, teams can bid on players using a limited FAB budget. That stands for free agent acquisition budget. The team with the highest bid gets the player. That's my preferred method. Other leagues, however, will use a waiver order. This is generally the reverse of the current standings, in theory, giving an advantage to the worst teams. In this situation, the worst team will get to pick off the options. Then the second worst team picks a player, with this process continuing until every team's made a pick. This process then repeats again until no more players are wanted. This whole process is automated. It doesn't actually happen like that. People aren't physically going there making selections. They simply submit an order of their preferred players, and the website will automate that whole process. So that means you should set up your list of preferred players each Tuesday. Though if you forget or choose not to, you're usually still okay. You also need to select when you choose you want to add a player, which player you would like to take off your team to replace that. You should always make sure that all of the spots on your roster is full. You don't want to waste any bench spot when you could have a player who could turn into something good if you just had them on your team. Once the waivers have run for the week, you can also add players after that as well, basically up until they play that week. Of course, these players are less likely to be valuable as everyone's already rejected the chance to select them during waivers. But it might be that you have a specific team need that you just realize one of your players just got injured, or you got some new information which leads you to believe that a player might have some value soon. Maybe one of their teammates got injured, and so you think, oh, they're going to get an opportunity. If you're looking for advice on adding players from waivers, you can check out my waiver videos during the season and my articles on Rasball, or you can just DM me during the season. So, what league should you join? Well, ideally, you just join a group of friends, but there are plenty of leagues online for people who have never met. But the internet can have a confusing amount of information about fantasy leagues, as there's many different types. If you're new to fantasy football, you definitely want to be joining a redraft league. If your league doesn't say otherwise, it's probably a redraft league. This means you're going to draft a new team every year, which is the best option for a newbie as you can keep getting better each year as you gain more experience. Some league types to avoid when you're new to fantasy football include dynasty leagues, keeper leagues, best ball leagues, auction leagues, also called salary cap leagues, IDP leagues, and DFS competitions. These are a whole lot of fun when you've got some experience, but they require a whole lot more understanding. Now, if you're interested, here's a short explanation of those leagues, or you can just skip forward if you're not worried. So in a dynasty league, you retain your entire team for a year. Once a player is on your team, they stay there indefinitely until you replace them. As a result, after the initial draft, each year you'll only draft rookies who are new to the NFL or any players that haven't been drafted onto a team. That's why on the internet, you'll see many rankings and articles discussing dynasty and rookie rankings. I would avoid anything dynasty related for at least your first couple of seasons, as if you're still new when you start, you're going to be stuck with this average team you drafted indefinitely. Now, keeper leagues are kind of like dynasty leagues, except you only keep some players and only for a limited time period. There's a full draft each year, but some players won't be available as they've been kept by teams that year. It's kind of like a mixture of a redraft league and a dynasty league. I wouldn't recommend it. It actually takes a whole lot more talent than you'd think to get that balance right. Now, best ball leagues don't require you to set a starting lineup at all. Essentially, you just fill your bench, and at the end of the week, the highest scoring players will automatically be the ones that score points for you. Now, that sounds simpler, but it's actually a more complicated drafting strategy, and it's significantly less fun during the season because you can't do anything with your team after that. Now, auction or salary cap leagues replace the draft with an auction, and that's really fun, especially if you do it in person. But you should be avoiding it until you have more experience, as it requires a whole lot more good player valuation. Now, in an IDP league, you draft all those defensive players I talked about earlier, in addition to all the offensive players. It basically stands for Individual Defensive Player League. This is complex, even for fantasy football veterans. Having said that, I do have a video on it if you want to check it out later. DFS competitions are 1 week competitions, which are almost totally unrelated to standard fantasy football outside the scoring procedures. I'd also avoid these until you have a good understanding of fantasy football. Now, fantasy football is a complicated game that takes quite a while to learn and get right. But the great thing is that with a little luck, even a newbie can win. So I hope you'll hop in and give it a go this fantasy season. If you do decide to try fantasy football this year, here's my top 10 tips. Number 1, be careful with online rankings. While these are an important starting point, you shouldn't follow them religiously. For example, if you've already drafted the quarterback, you don't need to draft a second one just because they're ranked higher. Realistically, the same also goes for tight ends. In most leagues, I'll only have one quarterback, one tight end, one kicker, and one DST on my whole roster. Running backs and wide receivers are just way more valuable, and you can start more of them. So having some that come out of nowhere and play well is more likely to happen and actually be usable for you. Number 2, NFL games are played on Thursday nights, Sunday afternoons and evenings, and Monday evenings, assuming you live in the American time zones. As a result, you should check your roster on Thursday afternoon and Sunday morning to ensure there aren't any surprises. On most hosting websites, you'll see little notifications or tags next to players who are injured or have some other relevant news. You'll also see a Q next to some players. That means they're questionable, which means we don't know whether they're going to start. You may also see Ds, which means doubtful, which means they probably won't play. And you'll sometimes see an O, which means out, which means they're definitely not playing that week. You can usually find some news online before the games start as to whether a player is actually going to start or not. Also note that waivers usually run on Tuesday nights if you're in America. So you'll want to set up your waiver preferences before then each week. This can be tricky at first, so DM me on Instagram or Twitter if you need help. Number 3. As a general rule, if a player is playing on Thursday night, don't put them in your flex spot. Put them in the applicable running back or wide receiver spot. This will give you more flexibility for that flex spot to come Sunday. Number 4. DSTs and kickers totally lack value. You should draft them in the last 2 rounds of your drafts. You should never, ever, ever trade for one, and you should replace them the moment they have an injury or a bye. There are very few exceptions to the bye issue unless your DST is outstanding. For the most part, you'll always find a better kicker or DST available somewhere on waivers. Number 5. Your bench should be filled with running backs and wide receivers. I've talked about this before, but it's really important. If you have a very good running back who has one clear backup, you should also have the backup on your roster. This is called a handcuff. If your star running back gets injured, you'll at least get solid replacement value using his backup. Each week in my Raspberry article, I list the most valuable handcuffs. It's also a viable tactic and one I use all the time to draft other people's handcuffs. That way, if their player gets injured, you have a highly valuable player. It's a lot better to have a player who might be very valuable in the future than a player you're not using who has limited value no matter what happens. Number 6. Now, you hear a lot of buzzwords online during fantasy football stuff. Here's what they mean. Studs are fantastic, reliable players who are safe options. Busts are players expected to disappoint this year. Sleepers are players expected to outperform expectations this year. Breakouts are players expected to have their first great season. These 3 terms, of course, are subjective and often incorrect predictive terms. For example, someone saying someone's a bust doesn't mean they necessarily will be. They're just saying that they believe other people are valuing this player too highly. Now, streamers are players you plan to use for only 1 week because they have a weak opponent that week or because someone else ahead of them is temporarily injured. Stashes are players you plan to place on your bench for later on. Upside or ceiling means the best possible or reasonably possible outcome for a player that week or over the course of the season. Floor means the opposite of that. It's basically what's the worst possible or reasonably possible outcome for a player. Upside or ceiling is really valuable for players on your bench. You want players who could have something really good happen later in the season. Whereas floor is more valuable for studs and starting players. You want a high floor on your guys that you're definitely starting, so you know every week they're likely to give you a good amount of points. Players who either don't have a high floor or a high ceiling, or sometimes both, are called boom or bust players. This refers to players who have some fantastic weeks and some terrible weeks, as opposed to good, consistent production. Doesn't make them bad. It just means that you are going to expect a little bit more variability. Now, a mock draft is basically a practice draft. There are many sites online that let you practice drafting against either a computer or other live people without actually having to play the league afterwards. You can pull out halfway through the mock draft if you want to, but ideally don't. Stay to the end is better. I recommend doing these if you're new to fantasy football. Now, you'll see a whole lot of strategies online, such as Zero RB, Hero RB, a whole heap of other things going on. Basically, they're just references to how you draft your team. Zero RB, for example, is where you don't draft a running back until the later rounds. You'll hear a heap of different things online. For the most part, these can be ignored. Honestly, I tend to ignore them these days. Just draft the players that are going to give you the best team based on what's available. Number 7. There are also a number of acronyms. There's also a number of acronyms you'll hear around the place. Here's what they mean. ADP means average draft position. It's an indication of when a player was drafted on average across all the leagues hosted on that site. So it's a good predictor of when players are going to be drafted in your league. It's not a guarantee, but it does mean that if you're drafting a player whose ADP is a lot lower than your current pick, maybe you can wait a round or two and still get that player later on. ECR is a metric used by fantasy pros. It stands for Expert Consensus Ranking, and it's essentially an average ranking using all the best experts across the world. You'll often see it on other sites to give you an indication of how that particular expert ranks a player compared to the rest of the industry. So it's important to give you an idea of whether a person you trust potentially thinks this player is a lot better than the average person does. Number 8. You'll often hear players being called the QB1, the RB2, the WR3. These codes are basically just where the letter refers to their positions, but the numbers are a little bit more confusing. Typically, the 1, so a RB1, for example, means that the player is ranked among the top 12 in their position. A 2 means they're ranked from 13 to 24. A 3 means they're ranked from 25 to 36. That's, of course, based on the idea that in most leagues, you have 12 competitors. Of course, that's not always the case, but to keep it consistent, we usually go in groups of 12. Confusingly, though, sometimes this format's also used to describe a player's overall ranking within a position. For example, if I said the WR7 in 2023, I'm referring to the player who received the 7th most points in 2023. Not the 7th group of 12, but just the 7th best player. That can, of course, be quite confusing because it's a contradiction of what I just said a second ago. But you'll see both those formats used. Typically, if it's a number between 1 and 4, it probably means the first group of 12 or the 4th group of 12. If it's a number bigger than that, it probably means just their overall position. Number 9. Trash talk's a big part of fantasy football in many leagues, though not all. But if you're engaging in it, make sure you keep it friendly and understand the culture of your league. Every league's going to be different. If you're playing with friends, you should know what they're like, and you should expect something going along with that, but be nice. I'd expect a little bit of joshing during drafts and when trades happen, but banter doesn't mean you've done anything wrong or picked a bad player. It might be that those other people just don't know what they're doing. But you should be very careful when others are offering you advice. A lot of people will take advantage of newbies by trying to get them to do something that benefits them. So a lot of people offering advice will be self-serving. Just know your friends or know the people you're talking to. And if you want good advice, go to someone online that you can trust. I'm always available. There are a lot of other people out there who are very good at this as well. Number 10, most importantly, remember, fantasy football should be fun. This is why we do it. Winning is fun, but so is spending time with friends. So is enjoying watching football and just cheering on your team. So is just trying to do your best. So no matter what happens, get out there and go and have fun. Now, if you have any questions, remember, I'm always here to help. I hope you'll consider liking this video and subscribing on YouTube. I've got heaps of advice videos up there. If you need rankings, you can check out my rankings videos where I break down every player and you get to know a lot of the players better that way. I answer all questions on my Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. Plus, I post rankings and advice over there as well. You can find me on Twitter at the Fantasy First Down with no O. Sorry, just Fantasy First Down with no O, where I put out links to most of my content. You can also find my rankings on ffdfantasyfootball.com, and I recommend you use them if you've got drafts coming up and you want to give it a go. Remember, you'll also want redraft rankings for your leagues. You can also find my articles at football.rasbull.com. I hope you found this video informative, and if you think I missed anything, let me know in the comments. I hope to see you next time on the Fantasy First Down.